The autumn sun cast long shadows across Windsor Great Park as King Charles III stood at the window of his private study, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than it did on this crisp October morning in 2023. Before him lay a decision that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy and forever alter the relationship between two brothers who had once played together in these same gardens. Andrew, Duke of York, had no idea that his elder brother was about to make the most decisive move of his reign. The younger prince was at that very moment enjoying his morning ride through the estate grounds, blissfully unaware that his privileged life within the royal fold was about to come to an abrupt end. The horses' hooves echoed across the centuries-old paths, each sound marking what would be among his last moments of unfettered access to the royal properties he had called home for 6 decades. The roots of this extraordinary moment stretched back years, through a tangled web of scandal, privilege, and the changing face of a modern monarchy. Charles had watched from his position as Prince of Wales as controversy after controversy swirled around his younger brother. The association with Jeffrey Epstein, the disastrous BBC interview, the civil lawsuit in America. Each incident had chipped away at the royal family's carefully cultivated image of dignity and service. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior courtiers moved with unusual urgency. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, had been working through the night preparing the necessary documentation. The legal team had reviewed every clause, every precedent, every possible ramification. This was not merely a family dispute to be settled over afternoon tea. This was a constitutional matter that required the utmost care and precision. The Queen's death just over a year earlier had changed everything. Elizabeth II, with her remarkable ability to manage family crises while maintaining public composure, had always served as a buffer between her sons. She had protected Andrew even as public opinion turned sharply against him, allowing him to maintain his royal lodge, his security detail, and his position within the family hierarchy. But Charles had made it clear from the moment of his accession that his reign would be different, streamlined, modern, and responsive to public sentiment. The morning meetings had been particularly tense. Charles sat at the head of the polished oak table in the yellow drawing room, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The Princess Royal, Anne, had been invited to attend, her practical wisdom and unwavering loyalty to the crown making her an invaluable voice in these deliberations. She sat ramrod straight, her expression betraying nothing of the turmoil that such a decision must have caused within her. The public will no longer tolerate it, the king stated firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his position. The monarchy must be above reproach. We serve at the pleasure of the people, and the people have made their feelings abundantly clear. The financial implications alone were staggering. Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion where Andrew had lived since 2003, required enormous upkeep. The annual costs ran into millions of pounds, money that came, directly or indirectly, from the public purse. In an era of economic hardship, when ordinary Britons were struggling with the cost of living crisis, the sight of a disgraced prince living in luxury had become politically untenable. William, Prince of Wales, had been instrumental in pushing for decisive action. The future king understood perhaps better than anyone that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to evolve and respond to changing times. He had witnessed the public's reaction to his brother's scandals, had seen the polls showing plummeting support for the institution, and knew that dramatic action was necessary. The preparations had been meticulous. Alternative accommodations had been quietly arranged, nothing that would constitute cruel treatment, but certainly a significant downgrade from the splendor of Royal Lodge. A modest property on the Sandringham estate had been prepared, far from the public eye, and suitable for a man who would need to live out his days in relative obscurity. As the morning progressed, Charles found himself thinking of their mother. Elizabeth had always believed in the institution above all else, had sacrificed personal happiness repeatedly for the good of the crown. Would she understand this decision? Would she approve? He believed she would, even if it would have broken her heart to see one son exile another. The legal mechanisms were complex but clear. As sovereign, Charles had considerable power over the royal properties. Royal Lodge was held on a lease from the Crown Estate, and while Andrew had certain rights as a long-term tenant, there were provisions that could be invoked. The withdrawal of public funding for security was perhaps the most powerful lever. Without protection, Andrew could not realistically remain in such a prominent location. By midday, the stage was set. Andrew had been summoned to a private audience with the king. Such meetings were not unusual, but there was something different about this one. The formal nature of the summons, the presence of senior courtiers, the absence of any other family members, all pointed to something significant. Andrew arrived at Buckingham Palace in his Range Rover, waving cheerfully to the guards as he had done thousands of times before. He was dressed casually, expecting perhaps a discussion about upcoming family events or minor administrative matters. The reality that awaited him would be far different. The walk through the palace corridors seemed longer than usual. Portraits of ancestors gazed down from the walls. Kings and queens who had faced their own crises, who had made their own difficult decisions about family members who had brought scandal to the crown. History was watching, and Charles knew he would be judged not just by his contemporaries, but by generations to come. The meeting room had been carefully chosen. Not the informal sitting rooms where family gatherings typically occurred, but one of the staterooms. A setting that emphasized this was the king acting in his official capacity, not merely as an elder brother. The symbolism would not be lost on Andrew. As the Duke of York entered the room, he immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. Charles stood rather than sitting, his expression serious but not unkind. The documents were already laid out on the table, their official seals visible even from a distance. This was not a negotiation, it was a pronouncement. Andrew, Charles began, his voice steady despite the emotion he must have felt. What I must tell you today is perhaps the hardest thing I have ever had to do as your brother. But, as king, I have responsibilities that supersede personal feelings. The color drained from Andrew's face as his brother continued. The words seemed to hang in the air. Withdrawal of privileges, vacation of royal properties, private citizen status. Each phrase was another blow to a man who had known nothing but privilege his entire life. The specific terms were laid out with clinical precision. Andrew would have 30 days to vacate Royal Lodge. His security detail, paid for by the taxpayer, would be withdrawn at the end of that period. His remaining military affiliations, already suspended, would be permanently severed. He would retain his title as Duke of York, but would no longer be addressed as His Royal Highness in any official capacity. Most painfully, his access to the sovereign grant, the funding that supported working royals, would be completely cut off. He would need to support himself through his naval pension and whatever private means he had managed to accumulate. For a man who had never truly had to worry about money, this would be a shocking adjustment. Andrew's reaction was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and desperation. He argued, pleaded, and even threatened legal action. But Charles remained unmoved. The decision had been made not in haste, but after months of careful consideration. The monarchy's survival required sacrifice, and Andrew would have to be that sacrifice. The meeting lasted less than an hour, but its repercussions would last forever. As Andrew left Buckingham Palace that day, he was no longer a prince of the realm in any meaningful sense. He was a private citizen who happened to have a title, facing an uncertain future without the protective embrace of the institution that had defined his entire existence. News of the meeting spread quickly through royal circles. Staff at Royal Lodge began to notice unusual activity, inventories being taken, assessments being made. The Duke himself retreated to his private apartments, refusing calls and canceling engagements. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. Charles, meanwhile, returned to his study. The deed was done, but there was no satisfaction in it. He had done what he believed was necessary for the institution he had sworn to protect and serve. The monarchy would survive this crisis, as it had survived so many others. But the personal cost was high, and the family wounds inflicted this day would likely never fully heal. As evening fell over London, the king attended a state dinner as if nothing had happened. He smiled, made small talk with dignitaries, and fulfilled his ceremonial duties with practiced ease. But those who knew him well could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of the decision he had made. The British public, when news eventually broke, would largely support the king's actions. Polls would show overwhelming approval for the decisive handling of what had become an intolerable situation. Editorial writers would praise Charles for putting the institution above family loyalty. The monarchy's approval ratings would rise, validating the difficult choice. But in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace that night, Charles was not thinking of polls or public opinion. He was thinking of two young boys playing in the gardens of Balmoral, building sandcastles on the beach at Holkham, riding ponies through the Scottish Highlands. He was thinking of his brother, alone in a grand house he would soon have to leave, facing a future he had never imagined. The machinery of change had been set in motion. Over the coming days, lawyers would finalize documents, moving companies would be contacted, and a life of extraordinary privilege would be systematically dismantled. Andrew would fight, of course. It was in his nature. But the outcome was predetermined. The king had spoken, and his word was final. As Charles prepared for bed that night, he paused at the window one more time. The lights of London twinkled below, a city and a nation that looked to him for leadership. He had given them what they needed, a monarchy that could adapt, that could make hard choices, that could put duty above personal feeling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of his resolve. But tonight, in the quiet of his private chambers, Charles allowed himself a moment of purely human emotion. He had exiled his brother, had torn the family apart in service to the crown. It was necessary, it was right, but it was also heartbreaking. The crown was heavy indeed, and tonight it felt almost unbearable. The first phase of Andrew's exile had begun. The royal machinery that had protected and sustained him for 60 years was withdrawing its support. Soon, he would face the world not as a prince, but as a private citizen, stripped of the privileges he had taken for granted his entire life. The kingdom would wake tomorrow to news that would shock many but surprise few. The king had taken bold action, and the consequences would ripple through the royal family for years to come. In the darkness of the October night, as London slept unaware of the drama that had unfolded within palace walls, two brothers lay awake in their separate residences. One contemplating the weight of duty and the price of leadership, the other facing the reality of a fall from grace so complete, so final, that there could be no coming back. The die was cast, the Rubicon crossed. The exile of Prince Andrew had begun. The morning after the fateful meeting broke gray and drizzly over Royal Lodge, matching the mood within its walls. Prince Andrew stood in his study, surrounded by decades of accumulated possessions, each item a reminder of a life that was rapidly slipping away. Photographs with world leaders, ceremonial sword from his naval career, gifts from foreign dignitaries. All would need to be sorted, packed, and removed within 30 days. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, had arrived early that morning. Despite their divorce decades earlier, she had remained a constant in Andrew's life, still residing in Royal Lodge under an arrangement that had raised eyebrows but been tolerated during the Queen's reign. Now, her own future was uncertain. She found her former husband in a state of shock, alternating between rage and disbelief. "They can't do this," Andrew insisted for what must have been the 100th time. "Mother gave us this home. She wanted us here. Charles has no right. He has every right," Sarah interrupted gently. "He's the king, Andrew. And more importantly, the public demands it." The truth of her words stung. Andrew had spent so many years insulated from public opinion, protected by his mother's affection and the palace machinery, that he had never truly grasped how far his star had fallen. The Jeffrey Epstein scandal had been a watershed moment, but he had convinced himself it would blow over, as royal scandals always had before. At Buckingham Palace, Charles was already dealing with the fallout. The press office had prepared statements, but controlling the narrative would be challenging. News of such magnitude could not be kept secret for long, especially with moving vans soon to arrive at Royal Lodge and legal documents being filed. William and Catherine had been briefed, and had expressed their full support. The Prince of Wales had long believed that his uncle's presence was damaging the monarchy's future. Catherine, ever the diplomat, had remained publicly neutral but privately agreed that action was necessary. The younger generation understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to evolve and respond to public sentiment. The logistics of Andrew's removal were staggering. Royal Lodge was not simply a home. It was a quasi-official residence with state rooms used for entertaining, offices for correspondence, and quarters for staff. The domestic staff, some of whom had served Andrew for decades, faced an uncertain future. Many would be reassigned within the royal household, but others would need to seek new employment. Andrew's private secretary, a long-suffering individual who had weathered scandal after scandal, was tasked with the impossible job of winding down a princely household. Correspondence needed to be redirected, charitable patronages formally relinquished, and a lifetime of royal connections severed. Each letter sent was another tie cut, another door closed. The financial implications were becoming clearer by the hour. Andrew's annual allowance from the sovereign grant had been substantial, covering not just personal expenses, but the costs of maintaining his public role. Without it, his financial position was precarious. His naval pension was modest by royal standards, and his rumored private wealth was largely tied up in illiquid assets. The search for alternative accommodation had revealed the stark reality of his new situation. The modest property on the Sandringham estate that had been suggested was a far cry from Royal Lodge's grandeur. It was a perfectly respectable home by any normal standard, a 5-bedroom house with pleasant gardens. But for a man accustomed to 30 rooms and sprawling grounds, it might as well have been a cottage. As news began to leak, the media response was swift and largely supportive of the king. Editorial writers who had long called for Andrew to face consequences praised Charles for his decisive action. The tabloids, never fond of Andrew even before his scandals, were triumphant. "Andy banished," screamed one headline, while another declared, "King's justice. Charles Exile's shameful brother." Public opinion polls conducted in the immediate aftermath showed overwhelming support for the decision. The British people, it seemed, had long ago made up their minds about Andrew, and Charles's action was seen as overdue rather than harsh. The younger generation, in particular, expressed relief that the monarchy was finally addressing what they saw as an embarrassing anachronism. Within the royal family, reactions were mixed. Princess, and ever the pragmatist, publicly supported her brother the king, while privately ensuring Andrew knew she was available if needed. Prince Edward and Sophie maintained a careful neutrality, understanding that their own positions within the slimmed-down monarchy required them to avoid controversy. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie faced the most difficult position. Andrew's daughters had built their own lives and careers, carefully distancing themselves from their father's scandals while maintaining family loyalty. Now they faced the impossible task of supporting their father while not antagonizing the king, who controlled their own royal futures. Beatrice, recently married and building her own family, took a measured approach. She visited her father at Royal Lodge, but was careful not to criticize the king's decision publicly. Eugenie, always closer to her father, was more emotionally affected. She spent hours at Royal Lodge, helping to sort through possessions and offering what comfort she could. The legal battles began almost immediately. Andrew's lawyers argued that the lease on Royal Lodge, signed in 2003, gave him tenancy rights that could not be arbitrarily revoked. The Crown Estate's lawyers countered that the lease contained clauses about maintaining the property to certain standards and that without the sovereign grant, Andrew could not fulfill these obligations. The security issue proved to be the decisive factor. The Metropolitan Police made it clear that without public funding, they could not justify the substantial security operation required for Royal Lodge. Private security would cost millions annually, far beyond Andrew's means. Without protection, insurance companies would not cover the property, making residence there practically impossible. Harry and Meghan, watching from California, found themselves in an unexpectedly complex position. Their own departure from royal duties had been voluntary, if acrimonious. Andrew's exile was forced, a punishment rather than a choice. Harry's spokesperson released a carefully worded statement about family difficulties that managed to express sympathy without taking sides. The international press covered the story with a mixture of fascination and schadenfreude. American outlets focused on the connection to the Epstein scandal and the civil case that had precipitated Andrew's fall. European papers analyzed the constitutional implications of a monarch exiling a family member. The story dominated news cycles for days. Behind the scenes, negotiations continued over the details of Andrew's departure. Charles, despite the necessity of his actions, was not vindictive. He ensured that Andrew would receive a grace and favor home, albeit a modest one, and that transitional funding would be available to help establish his new life. But the terms were non-negotiable. Andrew must accept his new status or face complete ostracization. The church played an unexpected role in the drama. Andrew had long been a regular at the Royal Chapel of All Saints in Windsor Great Park. The question of whether he could continue to attend services there became a symbolic battleground. Charles ultimately decided that Andrew could worship wherever he chose, but he would no longer have a place in the royal pew or any ceremonial role. As the 30-day deadline approached, the reality of moving became overwhelming. Royal Lodge contained not just Andrew's possessions, but decades of family history. Items that had belonged to the Queen Mother, gifts from the late Queen Elizabeth, artwork collected over generations, all needed to be cataloged and dispersed. Some would go to other royal residences, some to storage, and some would remain with Andrew in his reduced circumstances. The Duchess of York faced her own crisis. Her presence at Royal Lodge had always been at Andrew's invitation. With his departure, she too would need to find new accommodation. The unusual arrangement that had seen her living with her ex-husband for years was finally coming to an end. She began her own search for a new home, her financial situation even more precarious than Andrew's. Staff at Royal Lodge began the melancholy task of closing down the household. The butler, who had served Andrew for 20 years, supervised the packing of the Duke's personal effects with military precision. The gardeners, who had maintained the magnificent grounds, prepared detailed handover notes for their successors. The cook prepared final meals in a kitchen that had catered to royalty for generations. Andrew's attempts to negotiate better terms grew increasingly desperate. He proposed various compromises. Could he remain at Royal Lodge if he paid rent? Could he keep a small apartment within the property? Could the transition period be extended? Each proposal was politely but firmly rejected. The king's decision was final. The psychological impact on Andrew became increasingly apparent. Friends who visited described a man in denial, still believing that somehow the decision would be reversed. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, with financial advisors, with anyone who might offer a solution. But there was no solution to be found. The monarchy had spoken, and its word was law. Charles, meanwhile, pressed ahead with his vision for a streamlined monarchy. The savings from Andrew's removal would be redirected to charitable causes, a public relations move that further emphasized the contrast between the working royals and the exiled prince. The message was clear: the monarchy existed to serve, not to provide luxury for those who had brought it into disrepute. As moving day approached, the circus around Royal Lodge intensified. Photographers camped outside the gates, hoping to capture the moment of Andrew's departure. Security was increased to prevent any undignified scenes. The palace was determined that, whatever the circumstances, the process would be handled with appropriate dignity. Andrew's final week at Royal Lodge was marked by a series of small farewells. He walked the grounds one last time, revisiting favorite spots where he had ridden horses, walked dogs, and entertained guests. He stood in the room where his mother had visited him, where they had shared private conversations away from the public eye. Each memory was now tinged with loss. The actual move was conducted with military precision. Professional movers, sworn to secrecy, arrived before dawn. Box after box was loaded onto unmarked vans, each one representing another piece of Andrew's former life being stripped away. By evening, Royal Lodge stood empty of his possessions, ready for its next chapter. Andrew's departure from Royal Lodge was deliberately low-key. There were no official farewells, no ceremonial handovers. He left as he had been forced to live in recent years, quietly, without fanfare, trying to avoid the cameras that sought to document his humiliation. His car pulled away from the gates for the last time, heading not for another palace, but for a modest house where he would begin his life as a private citizen. The Sandringham property that awaited him was pleasant enough. 5 bedrooms, well-maintained gardens, privacy from prying eyes. By any normal standard, it was a lovely home. But for Andrew, accustomed to grandeur, it must have felt like a prison. The contrast was deliberate, comfortable enough that no one could accuse the king of cruelty, modest enough to satisfy public demands for accountability. That night, as Andrew settled into his new residence, the reality of his exile truly began to sink in. No staff awaited his commands. No secretary managed his correspondence. No protection officers secured his perimeter. He was, for the first time in his life, truly alone with the consequences of his actions. At Buckingham Palace, Charles retired early, exhausted by the emotional toll of recent weeks. He had done what was necessary, what duty demanded. The monarchy would emerge stronger from this crisis, more aligned with public expectations, more fit for purpose in the 21st century. But the personal cost was high, and the family dynamics would never be the same. The second phase of Andrew's exile was complete. The physical removal from Royal Lodge was just the beginning. Now came the harder task of building a new life without the privileges, protections, and purpose that had defined his existence for 6 decades. The kingdom moved on, the monarchy adapted, but for Andrew, time seemed to stand still in a modest house in Norfolk, where a prince contemplated a future he had never imagined. The media coverage began to shift from the drama of exile to analysis of its implications. Constitutional experts debated the precedent Charles had set. Would other royals face similar consequences if they stepped out of line? Had the king established a new standard of accountability? The answers would only become clear with time, but the message was unmistakable. The monarchy of King Charles III would be different from that of his mother. As autumn turned to winter, life settled into new patterns. Royal Lodge was quietly repurposed, its state rooms closed to save on maintenance, its grounds maintained by a skeleton staff. Andrew's new home in Sandringham saw few visitors, its occupant adjusting to a life of enforced irrelevance. The kingdom had moved on, history had been made, and the exile of a prince had become just another chapter in the long story of the British monarchy that winter's grip had settled firmly over Norfolk as Andrew marked his 3rd month in exile. The modest house at Sandringham, which had initially felt like a prison, had become his entire world. The grand receptions, state dinners, and royal engagements that had once filled his calendar were now distant memories, replaced by empty days that stretched endlessly before him. The British public had largely moved on from the story of his exile, their attention captured by new scandals and crises. But for Andrew, every day was a reminder of his fall from grace. He had attempted to establish routines, morning rides on a modest horse he had been allowed to keep, afternoon walks in the small garden, evenings spent reading or watching television. But the contrast with his former life was inescapable. Financial reality had hit hard and fast. Without the sovereign grant, Andrew's income was limited to his naval pension and whatever private investments he had managed to accumulate over the years. The pension, while respectable for a retired naval officer, was wholly inadequate for someone accustomed to royal expenditure. His private investments, it turned out, were less substantial than rumored, many having been eroded by poor decisions and the legal costs of fighting various scandals. The Duchess of York had found her own accommodation, a modest rental property in Windsor. The separation that their divorce had failed to achieve had finally been forced upon them by circumstance. They maintained contact, Sarah visiting when she could, but the easy companionship of Royal Lodge was gone. She too was struggling financially, her various business ventures providing inconsistent income. King Charles, meanwhile, had pressed ahead with his modernization agenda. The money saved from Andrew's removal from royal funding had been redirected to charitable causes, a move that garnered positive press coverage. The streamlined monarchy was taking shape, with working royals focused on specific areas of national interest and clear expectations about conduct and accountability. William had emerged as a key figure in the new order. The Prince of Wales had taken on additional responsibilities, his steady presence and modern approach winning public approval. He had made no public comment about his uncle's exile, but privately he remained convinced it had been necessary for the monarchy's survival. Catherine's popularity continued to soar, her grace and dignity providing a stark contrast to the scandals that had plagued Andrew. The legal battles that Andrew had initiated had largely fizzled out. His lawyers had pursued various avenues of challenge, but the crown's position was legally sound. The lease on Royal Lodge contained provisions that Andrew, without public funding, simply could not meet. The withdrawal of security made occupation impossible. One by one, his legal options had been exhausted. Princess Beatrice had given birth to her second child during this period, a moment of joy in an otherwise difficult time for the family. Andrew had been invited to the christening, but in a strictly private capacity. There were no official photographs, including him, no mention of his attendance in the court circular. He was there as a grandfather, nothing more, his royal status effectively erased. Eugenie struggled more visibly with the situation. She had always been protective of her father, and seeing him isolated and diminished was painful. She visited regularly, bringing her young son to spend time with his grandfather. These visits were bittersweet for Andrew. Joy at seeing his grandchildren mixed with the pain of knowing they would grow up with him as a marginal figure in their lives. The international community had watched Charles's handling of Andrew with interest. Other European monarchies, many facing their own challenges with wayward royals, took note of the decisive action. The King of Spain, dealing with his own family scandals, was reported to have consulted with Charles about the constitutional mechanisms used. The message was clear: even royalty could be held accountable in the modern age. Harry's position had become increasingly complex. His own voluntary exile to California had been motivated by different factors, but he couldn't help but see parallels with his uncle's forced removal. Meghan had counseled against any public comment, understanding that their own relationship with the crown was too fragile to risk involvement in this family drama. As spring approached, Andrew's isolation deepened. The social invitations that might have provided some relief had dried up completely. Former friends and associates, fearful of guilt by association, kept their distance. The military organizations he had once led had quietly removed his name from their letterheads. The charities he had patronized had found new patrons. He had become, in effect, a non-person in the circles he had once dominated. The psychological toll was evident to the few who still visited. Andrew had aged visibly, his former confidence replaced by a defensive bitterness. He spent hours writing letters to the king, to former associates, to anyone who might listen, protesting his treatment and asserting his innocence of any wrongdoing. Most went unanswered. Charles had established a small committee to oversee Andrew's transition, ensuring that while punishment was real, it did not cross into cruelty. Basic medical care was provided, essential maintenance on his new home was covered, and a modest allowance for food and necessities was arranged. But anything beyond the essential was Andrew's responsibility, and his resources were dwindling rapidly. The question of Andrew's future role at family events had become a constant source of tension. He had been excluded from the first state banquet of the new reign, a decision that had stung deeply. The upcoming Trooping the Color presented another dilemma. Traditionally, all members of the royal family appeared on the palace balcony. Would Andrew be invited? The palace's silence on the matter spoke volumes. Princess Anne had emerged as an unexpected intermediary. While publicly supporting Charles's decision, she privately worked to ensure Andrew wasn't completely cut off from family life. She arranged discreet family dinners where Andrew could see his siblings in private settings. These gatherings were awkward, conversations stilted, but they provided some human connection in his increasingly isolated existence. The financial pressure continued to mount. The upkeep on even his modest new home was substantial. Heating bills, maintenance costs, and basic living expenses quickly consumed his limited income. For the first time in his life, Andrew had to budget, to choose between competing expenses, to worry about money in a way that would have been unthinkable just months before. Attempts to generate income had met with failure. A rumored book deal had been quickly squashed by palace lawyers citing confidentiality agreements. Speaking engagements, once a potential source of revenue, were impossible given his toxic reputation. Business ventures were out of the question. No reputable company would associate with him. He was trapped in genteel poverty with no obvious escape route. The Sandringham estate staff had been instructed to treat Andrew with courtesy, but maintain professional distance. He was not to be given any special privileges or access to estate facilities beyond what any private resident might expect. The gamekeepers who had once facilitated his shooting parties now politely declined his requests. The stable staff who had cared for his horses were no longer available. Every interaction reinforced his changed status. Mental health support had been quietly arranged, though Andrew initially refused to engage. The isolation, the dramatic change in circumstances, and the public humiliation had taken their toll. Eventually, desperate for any human connection that didn't judge him, he began meeting with a therapist. These sessions, conducted in strict confidence, became one of the few constants in his new life. The upcoming coronation of King Charles presented the most significant test yet. As the son of a monarch and brother of the king, Andrew would traditionally have played a prominent role. But times had changed. The Coronation Planning Committee, after much deliberation, decided that Andrew would be invited as a family member, but would have no ceremonial role. He would attend but not participate, present but not prominent. This decision sparked another round of legal consultations. Andrew's representatives argued that excluding him from ceremonial roles violated centuries of precedent. The palace countered that precedent must yield to public sentiment and the needs of a modern monarchy. The debate raged privately for weeks before Andrew, perhaps finally, accepting reality, withdrew his objections. Sarah Ferguson's situation had also deteriorated. Her association with Andrew, even post-divorce, had made her toxic to potential business partners. Book sales had slumped, speaking engagements had dried up, and her various entrepreneurial ventures had struggled. She found herself in a position eerily similar to Andrew's, not formally exiled, but effectively excluded from the life she had known. The foreign press had begun to lose interest in the story, moving on to newer scandals and fresher drama. But in Britain, Andrew's exile had become a touchstone for debates about privilege, accountability, and the role of monarchy in modern society. Academic papers were written analyzing the constitutional implications. Documentary makers circled, though palace lawyers ensured no cooperation would be forthcoming. Charles's leadership during this period won grudging respect even from Republican voices. He had shown that the monarchy could police itself, could respond to public sentiment, could evolve. Polls showed the institution's popularity stabilizing and even growing among younger demographics who appreciated the accountability demonstrated. As summer approached, Andrew faced the prospect of his first birthday in exile. Once celebrated with grand parties and official recognition, his 64th birthday would pass quietly in Norfolk. Beatrice and Eugenie would visit perhaps and would call, but the court circular would make no mention of the date. He had become what he had never imagined possible, irrelevant. The transformation of Royal Lodge continued. Plans were quietly developed to repurpose the property, perhaps as a visitor attraction or for charitable purposes. Every change was another reminder that Andrew's exile was permanent, that there would be no quiet rehabilitation, no gradual return to favor. The king had made his decision, and it would stand. International royalty had begun to adjust their own relationships with Andrew. Invitations to weddings, funerals, and other royal gatherings no longer included him. He had become an embarrassment not just to the British monarchy, but to the entire royal fraternity. Even those who sympathized with his plight understood that association with him was impossible. The question of succession rights had been carefully examined. While Andrew retained his place in the line of succession, it was largely meaningless. He was so far removed from the throne, and his public standing so damaged, that any theoretical claim was purely academic. His daughter's positions were secure, Charles having made clear that sins of the father would not be visited upon them. As Andrew's first year of exile drew to a close, patterns had been established that would likely define the rest of his life. Morning rides within his small property, afternoon walks in the local area where he was unlikely to be recognized, evenings alone with his thoughts and regrets. The man who had once traveled the world as a trade envoy now rarely left Norfolk. The psychological impact extended beyond Andrew himself. The royal family had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and accountability. Younger royals understood that their positions were not guaranteed, that public service meant actual service, that scandal would no longer be tolerated or covered up. The age of impunity was over. Charles reflected often on his decision during this period. The burden of kingship included making choices that would define not just his reign, but the monarchy's future. He had chosen accountability over family loyalty, public duty over private affection. History would judge whether he had chosen correctly, but early indications suggested the British people supported his decision. The third phase of Andrew's exile had solidified into permanent reality. What had begun as a shocking family drama had settled into a new normal. Andrew would live out his days in comfortable obscurity, a cautionary tale for future royals about the consequences of scandal and the limits of privilege. The monarchy had survived another crisis, emerged perhaps stronger, but at the cost of a brother's exile and a family forever changed. The future stretched before Andrew, no longer bright with possibility, but gray with limitation. He would watch from afar as his nephews carried forward the monarchy he had once been part of. He would see his daughters build their lives carefully distant from a shadow. He would grow old not in the palaces of his youth, but in a modest house where a prince learned too late the price of scandal, and the weight of public judgment. 2 years had passed since Andrew's dramatic exile from Royal Lodge, and the seasons had cycled through twice in his modest Sandringham home. The man who had once stood at the heart of British royal life now existed at its furthest margins, watching from a distance as the monarchy evolved without him. King Charles's coronation had come and gone, a magnificent spectacle that showcased the continuity and adaptation of the ancient institution. Andrew had attended, as promised, in a strictly private capacity. Seated far from the center of action, dressed in a simple morning suit rather than ceremonial robes, he had watched his brother crowned while knowing he would never again play a meaningful role in royal ceremonies. The photographs from that day told the story more eloquently than any words could. While William and Catherine stood resplendent in their ceremonial roles, while Anne bore the crown of Scotland with dignity, while Edward participated in the ancient rituals, Andrew sat among distant cousins and minor nobility. The cameras had largely ignored him, focusing instead on the working royals who represented the monarchy's future. Life in Norfolk had settled into predictable rhythms. Andrew's days began early, not from choice, but from habit formed over decades of military service. He would make his own tea, a task that still felt foreign after a lifetime of being served, and read the newspapers that were delivered to his door. The court's circular, which had once featured his name regularly, now served as a daily reminder of his exclusion. Financial pressure had become Andrew's constant companion. His naval pension, modest by royal standards, barely covered basic expenses. The private investments he had hoped would sustain him had proven disappointing, many tied up in illiquid assets or diminished by poor management. He had been forced to sell several prized possessions, watches given as state gifts, artwork accumulated over decades, even some of his ceremonial uniforms that held no practical value but had fetched surprising sums from collectors. The Duchess of York's situation had stabilized somewhat. She had managed to secure a publishing deal for a series of children's books, providing modest but steady income. Her rental property in Windsor was far from the grandeur of Royal Lodge, but she had made it comfortable. The forced separation from Andrew had, paradoxically, improved her public standing slightly. No longer seen as part of his problematic orbit, she had carved out a small space for herself on the periphery of acceptable society. Beatrice and Eugenie had adapted to their father's changed circumstances with a mixture of loyalty and pragmatism. They visited regularly, but quietly, understanding that their own positions within the royal family required careful navigation. Beatrice's husband had proven particularly adept at managing the delicate balance, maintaining cordial relations with both Andrew and the palace while avoiding any public association with controversy. The grandchildren were perhaps the brightest spots in Andrew's constrained existence. Too young to understand the complexities of their grandfather's fall from grace, they brought uninhibited joy to his modest home. He had converted one room into a playroom, filled with toys and books purchased from his dwindling resources. These visits, though precious, were also painful reminders of all he had lost: the grand nurseries of Royal Lodge, the extensive grounds for exploration, the life of privilege his own daughters had enjoyed. King Charles had successfully transformed the monarchy during this period. The slimmed-down institution focused on core constitutional duties and carefully selected charitable causes. Public approval ratings had reached levels not seen since the early years of Elizabeth II's reign. The decisive handling of Andrew's situation was frequently cited as evidence of Charles's leadership and modernizing instincts. William had emerged as the clear future of the monarchy, his steady presence and modern approach winning widespread approval. He had taken on many of the roles Andrew had once filled, but with a professionalism and propriety that provided stark contrast. Trade missions once led by Andrew were now headed by William, conducted with transparency and clear benefit to British interests rather than personal gain. The international community had largely forgotten Andrew's existence. Former contacts in the Middle East, where he had once been a frequent visitor, no longer extended invitations. Business associates who had courted his influence had long since moved on to other connections. The network of relationships built over decades of royal service had evaporated like morning mist, leaving him truly alone. Harry and Meghan, from their California base, had maintained strict distance from the Andrew situation. Their own complex relationship with the royal family required careful navigation, and association with Andrew would have been fatal to any hopes of reconciliation. Harry had reportedly felt some sympathy for his uncle's isolation, but understood that any public expression of support would be catastrophic for his own position. The legal battles had finally ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Andrew's various challenges, to his removal from Royal Lodge, to the withdrawal of funding, to his exclusion from royal duties, had all failed. The courts had consistently upheld the Crown's position that these were matters of royal prerogative, not legal entitlement. The final appeal had been withdrawn when it became clear that continuing would only generate more negative publicity and legal costs he couldn't afford. Mental health support had become a crucial lifeline. The therapist who visited weekly had helped Andrew begin to process not just his current situation, but the behaviors and choices that had led to it. These sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, entitlement, and the consequences of his associations. Progress was slow, denial still strong, but gradually some self-awareness was emerging. The question of historical legacy had begun to preoccupy Andrew's thoughts. How would history remember him? Would he be merely a footnote in Charles's reign, a cautionary tale about the perils of scandal? Or would there be some recognition of his military service, his work as trade envoy before the scandals erupted? He spent hours writing what he hoped would be memoirs, though palace lawyers had made clear that publication would be blocked if it contained any confidential information. Local life in Norfolk had adjusted to Andrew's presence with typical British reserve. Shopkeepers served him politely, but without deference. Dog walkers nodded acknowledgement on country paths, but didn't stop to chat. He was neither celebrity nor pariah, just another resident of the area living quietly and causing no trouble. This anonymity, which would have horrified him once, had become a strange comfort. The Sandringham estate staff maintained professional distance as instructed. They would assist with genuine emergencies, but offered no special services. When severe weather damaged his roof, they arranged for repairs at standard commercial rates. When his heating system failed, they provided the same list of approved contractors given to any estate tenant. Every interaction reinforced his status as a private individual, not a princess, and had continued her role as unofficial family intermediary, arranging occasional gatherings where Andrew could see his siblings in private settings. These dinners were stilted affairs, conversation carefully avoiding controversial topics. Charles would inquire politely about Andrew's health. Edward would discuss neutral subjects like gardening or local matters, but the easy familiarity of their youth was gone forever. The financial situation had forced Andrew to make increasingly difficult choices. The modest house required constant maintenance that strained his budget. He had learned to perform basic repairs himself, YouTube videos teaching him skills that palace maintenance staff had once handled. The sight of a prince fixing his own leaking tap or painting his own fence would have been comedy if it weren't so tragic. Attempts to generate income had met with consistent failure. A proposed consultancy leveraging his international experience had attracted no clients. Speaking agencies had politely declined to represent him. Even minor opportunities, opening supermarkets or appearing at corporate events, were denied him. His toxicity was complete and apparently permanent. The absence of purpose perhaps hurt most of all. Andrew had spent his adult life with full calendars, scheduled appearances, and defined roles. Now days stretched empty before him. He had attempted to volunteer with local charities, but even they politely declined his offers. The man who had once represented Britain on the international stage couldn't even help at the village fete. Sarah Ferguson had found her own equilibrium during this period. Her children's books had found a modest audience, and she had developed a small but sustainable career as an author and occasional media personality. She visited Andrew regularly. Their relationship evolved into something resembling friendship rather than romance. Two people bound by shared history and mutual support in reduced circumstances. The coronation aftermath had solidified new royal hierarchies. William and Catherine were clearly the future, their children growing up with clear understanding of duty and service, and continued her tireless work with little fanfare. Edward and Sophie had carved out valuable supporting roles. The monarchy functioned smoothly without Andrew, proving that his exile had strengthened rather than weakened the institution. International perceptions had shifted completely. Where once Andrew had been seen as a useful, if problematic, royal connection, he was now viewed as an example of accountability. Other monarchies facing their own scandals pointed to Charles's decisive action as a model. The message was clear. No one was above consequences. Royal blood provided no immunity from judgment. As Andrew entered his third year of exile, certain realities had become inescapable. There would be no rehabilitation, no quiet return to favor, no forgiveness from a public that had made its judgment. He would live out his remaining years in this modest home, watching from afar as the monarchy moved forward without him. The man who had once flown helicopters in the Falklands War now struggled to afford fuel for his aging car. The prince who had traveled the world on official duties now rarely ventured beyond Norfolk. The royal who had lived in a 30-room mansion now worried about heating bills in a 5-bedroom house. The fall was complete and irreversible. Charles reflected on his decision with the perspective of time. The monarchy had emerged stronger, more relevant, more aligned with public expectations. The painful decision to exile his brother had proven correct, even necessary. History would record it as a moment when the British monarchy chose accountability over privilege, duty over family comfort. Andrew's story had become a cautionary tale whispered in palace corridors. Young royals understood that privilege came with responsibilities, that scandal would not be tolerated, that public service meant actual service. The age of impunity had ended with Andrew's exile, replaced by an era of accountability that would define the modern monarchy. As evening fell over Norfolk on another quiet day, Andrew sat alone in his modest living room. The television news covered the latest royal engagement. William launching an environmental initiative, Catherine supporting mental health causes. The monarchy thrived without him, perhaps because of his absence. He had become what he had never imagined possible, a former prince living in exile, a cautionary tale in a small house, a man who had lost everything through his own actions. The final phase of Andrew's story was not dramatic, but quietly tragic. No redemption awaited. No last act reconciliation would occur. He would grow old in this house, visited occasionally by daughters who built their lives carefully distant from his shadow. He would watch grandchildren grow up, knowing him not as a prince, but as a grandfather who lived quietly in Norfolk. He would fade from public memory, a footnote in histories of Charles's reign, remembered if at all as the prince who fell from grace and never rose again. The kingdom had moved on. The monarchy had adapted and survived. The king had made his choice, and history had validated it. And in a modest house in Norfolk, a man who had once been a prince lived with the consequences of scandal, the weight of exile, and the knowledge that some falls from grace are permanent. The exile of Prince Andrew was complete, irrevocable, and, in the judgment of history, necessary.